over to you. And unless it seems voyeuristic and uncomfortable to you, I'm gonna wait until.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm fine.
I know you are, but I would, if you were me, then suddenly something would go totally wrong in the middle and. Oh.
How's it going?
Are you good?
Yeah. Well, it looks like my clicker's not working, so I have to push buttons. Yeah. So how are y'all doing?
Good.
So how many, do you guys have any idea how many folks we have out in Zoom land?
Probably none. Zero.
Probably none. Okay. You never know, huh?
Yeah, they have.
See you later.
Did he tell us we were having a guest lecture? Lecture? I don't remember. I don't think
Yeah,
he
it
did.
was in the news
Oh.
message.
Oh.
He sent us like a email announcement thing.
Mm. Mm.
We can live with that. We can live with that. All right. So, good morning.
Come on.
And this is Humanities 222, Italian 260. How many of you are in here for the Italian course? Okay, well, you know, it's a double count, so. I'm filling in for Professor Katsona. He's out of town today. I can never keep track of where this guy goes. I think this time it might be like Austin. Yeah, he says he has a meeting, but if it were me, I'd be down in the restaurants and stuff this evening, finding some great food down on the border. but he'll be back shortly. And so I'm just going to fill in today and try to keep you on the schedule. We're over the halfway point now, but there's still an awful lot to cover in this course. And so I want to take, it's more of an architecture day today instead of music or painting, although we'll do a little bit of that. But I thought we'd try to situate some architecture in the 18th and 19th centuries to get a feel for some of the developments that came out after the Enlightenment, or you could even say during the Enlightenment. We will call this neoclassical. Now, let me ask a couple of questions. Have you already done any stuff on Enlightenment philosophers like Kant and Mill?
Yeah.
Right. So one of the things, let me just, before we get into this, and I won't have to bring it up in the middle. One of the things that obviously Kant in the 18th century and Mill in the 19th century are trying to do is to develop philosophies with a focus on moral philosophy that takes people beyond where the Western tradition had already been, right? So if you think about the precursors to the Enlightenment in terms of philosophy, you've really got two camps. You've got classical philosophy, and there you would be thinking of people like Plato and Aristotle. And you've got the church, right, running from roughly the 4th century up to the current period when Kant and Mill are writing. Both of those traditions there's things about both of those traditions that Kant and Mill want to reject when they're developing their philosophy during the Enlightenment and what we would call this kind of neoclassical period. And one of the things they want to reject is complexity. If you go back and read Aristotle, it's a beautiful system. His Ethics is a great book. But Aristotle believed that if you were going to describe the human condition fully, it was going to be a mess. It was going to be complex. And so, he's concerned with everything about how you act, what the end goals are that you're aiming for, what you ought or ought not to do in a given situation. Ethics for Aristotle was very complex because human existence is complex, right? Obviously, thanks again, Jason. I think we're working.
All right.
I even got my little thing, my little button going here.
What magic is this?
So I want to thank you for taking your time to bring me online again.
Time is very
Things seem to get more complicated every year. When we get to the 4th century and Constantine, he replaces the Greco-Roman world, philosophy and religion, with what he hopes will take root in the empire, which is Christianity. And Christianity also tries to deal with a complex range of issues in human life, but obviously with a central authority of God, right, as the author of philosophy, world, moral theory, and all that stuff. When we get to the Enlightenment, Kant wants to essentially abandon some aspects of those two thinkers. I'm not saying Kant wasn't nominally a Christian. I mean, he was probably some kind of closet Lutheran, right? But the point is that he wanted to reject the complexity of the Aristotelian model, and he wanted to reject the fact that in order to fully appreciate the morals of the Catholic Church, you had to be Catholic, right? He wanted to get away from natural law and revelation. And for Kant, then, the way that you do that is you emphasize human capacity to essentially generate or understand moral obligations. And so I think Katsona probably talked to you about the categorical imperative, right? What's beautiful about the categorical imperative is it's simple, unlike Aristotle. And secondly, you don't need God being the one who gives the divine commands. There are no more divine commands. There are only rational obligations, imperatives that come to you by the reflection of your own mind. Act in such a way that you would wish that your actions would be consistent with an imperative that you would wish would be universal law. right? Or the second formulation of the categorical imperative, act in such a way that you treat all people as ends in themselves and not as means to an end, right? If you practice this according to Kant, you can generate moral imperatives that can guide you through every moment of your life. And it might actually help you even develop moral norms for societies. Mill, who comes after Kant, doesn't buy into a lot of what Kant buys into. For Mill, the way you determine a good action is not its conformity to a categorical imperative, but conformity to a principle of maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number, right? But notice that for both of these thinkers, there is an abandonment of the complexity of Aristotle. There's an abandonment of the moral universe of the church. There's an emphasis on simplicity, and there's an emphasis on human rationality, right? As being able to accomplish this great task of generating moral norms, right? These two thinkers have one thing in common. One is a deontologist. You have duties intrinsic to the duty. The other is a utilitarian. You have duties based on the ends that you can attain. But both of them have one thing in common, and that is they're very optimistic about your ability to generate moral norms. Either calculating or listening to the voice of the imperative within you, both of them think that you can accomplish. It'll be easy, it'll be a task, but it can be done. You can accomplish a sense of what moral obligation is without Aristotelian complexity, without the church, without God, that sort of thing. I personally tend to think they read human beings a bit too optimistically, but you know, whatever. Those two thinkers, we're still reading them and they still inform a lot of what we do, right? And even in government, we oftentimes will critique certain policies based on whether we think it's going to maximize the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Or that would be a Millian way of thinking about it. Or in Kant's case, it's harming other people or using other people as a means to our end, right? So the great thing about it is that I think that you can map their philosophies onto the architecture we're looking at today. There are things about the architecture we're going to look at today that echo Mill and Kant in the Enlightenment. Rationality, simplicity, those kinds of things. So that's what we're going to get into. So we don't have to talk about Kant and Mill anymore or any of those folks, but understand that they are working at the same time that neoclassicism is arising as an architectural form. Okay, let me stop there, see if we have any questions, any confusion. Okay, so 1700s and 1800s, 18th century, 19th century. The classical revival, that's whenever you hear neo something, think about revival of the word, right? The classical revival refers to the movement in the arts that draws inspiration from classical art and culture, which we'll talk about in a minute, of ancient Greece and Rome. And it coincides with the Enlightenment era and continues into the early 19th century. So if you think about the rise of the revolution in the United States, right, in the late 1700s, and the rise of industrialization in England, both of those movements are at the front end of neoclassicism, right? If you think about the US, we're establishing ourselves in the early 19th century as a nation. We're doing our building projects around the states. The state houses are going up, the capital's going up, neoclassical period. But by the time we get to the rise of Victoria, Queen Victoria in 1837, when she ascends the throne, neoclassicism is pretty much over. There's going to be other movements that are coming on, but that period is done. So we really are looking at when it comes to, if you think about Baroque art, Rococo art, you're thinking of small periods of time. When you think about neoclassicism, you're thinking about something like maybe, certainly 50 years, maybe 70 years, right? A period of time, I don't know where most people put it, 1860, 1870 is a little late, 1760 to 1820 or 820 or 30, somewhere in there. And we'll talk more about this piece by Jacques-Louis David in a bit. So let's just rehearse. The precursors to this movement, the precursors to neoclassicism are classical, and I consider, when we use the word classical, I usually just think of Greece. Classical Greece, classical Rome, the rise of the Christian church through the early and late medieval. Also, the term Gothic gets used in the architecture world, but it's really medieval, right? And then Romanesque and Neo-Romanesque, which are reform movements on early Roman art, and then the Baroque, and then finally the Rococo. And I think you've already done some stuff on Baroque and Rococo. If not, we'll just flash through and take a look at those. So what neoclassicism is doing is essentially saying we've had this wonderful, 2,200-year run of the cultural development, but what we're doing is we're trying to get back to the early stages. What we want to do is go back to classical Greece and Rome, because in architecture, we think that they did it better than anybody else, right? And the argument tends to be that some choices are better aesthetically and morally than others, and that our own culture and our own personal characters, our own characters, our characteristics will be enhanced if we adopt this right cultural convention. So your personal character traits, your moral backbone, according to this argument, is going to be improved by the architecture that you live around. If you live around classical art and architecture, you're going to be one kind of person. If you live in the wasteland of the new Arts and Humanities building at Chico State, which is a modernist structure, you're going to have a different kind of cultural read, right? One is going to give coherence. One is going to lead to a dissipated character and problems. This is why when new buildings go up like this, and when I worked at Chico State, I worked on this building for 5 years as the dean of HFA. Almost every day I got a letter from somebody screaming at me for debasing the culture of Chico and the campus. I had people begging not to use black rock, but to use the brown rock. And even I, after the building was up, continued to rail against the university for putting stickers on the windows out here. If you walk by, you'll see some big "Do to Dare" stickers. Who would take sheet glass that costs $4,000 a sheet and put stickers on? But that's, these are the stakes that you're dealing with when you deal with issues in art and architecture. Right? Because I generally think in my life that moral issues are separate from aesthetic issues, right? It's much more at stake in making a determination about what the moral thing to do is than to make a decision about whether the building is going to be a neo-Romanesque building or a modern building. But in the world of architecture, I don't think that line is drawn as sharply as it is among people like me. Morals and aesthetics generally tend to go together, and we see a lot of that developing in current culture, right? A lot of arguments about this kind of stuff. So let's just take a look very quickly at a few examples from those precursors to neoclassicism, right? So the classic example, what many people would consider to be the greatest piece of architecture in Western civilization, dates back to the 5th century BC and is the Parthenon on the Acropolis in Athens in Greece, right? And for many people, this building typifies everything that was great about classicism: proportion, simplicity, beauty. It was actually a temple to the patron goddess of Athens, Athena Parthenos. Athena Parthenos means Athena born not through regular sex. She was parthenogenically created coming out of the head of her father Zeus, right? So she has only a father, no mother, right? And so the Parthenon was a tribute to the goddess, and there would have been a statue inside and rituals would have been performed. She also has another temple off to the corner there, you can see it on the far left corner, the Temple of Athena Nike, right? Which means Nike, of victory, right? And so very central, but this is the cornerstone of when you think about classicism and when you think about neoclassicism, this is what they're pointing back to. We also have this tradition continuing in the Roman Empire that really takes off in the 1st century BCE and carries through to the 4th century. And perhaps the best example of classic Roman architecture is the Pantheon in Rome. It's not very big. It's the last building constructed in Europe with a dome on it before, in Western Europe, before the dome on the cathedral in Florence is constructed 1400 years later. People forgot how to build domes. And you do have a dome on the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul under the Orthodox Church. So maybe 700 years they forgot how to do it. But this is the Pantheon in Rome is a temple to all of the gods, right? So unlike in the Christian tradition where your cathedrals are only to one god, right? The Pantheon is a temple to the gods that would have been considered in the orbit of Rome, and the architecture, you can tell immediately, mimics in some ways the Greek architecture, right? It's a bit more, I would say it's a bit more brutal. It's not, doesn't have quite that warm feeling, Roman architecture, I think, but it certainly gets the message of classical proportion across, right? With the pillars, and we'll talk a bit more about that later, but the structures and the balance and the proportions. Now, when the Roman Empire eventually falls to the Northern Europeans in the 5th century, right? What happens is a new form of Roman architecture comes in called Romanesque. It's Roman-like, but it's not really Roman, right? The classic example of this in my book is the pilgrimage church of Vézelay in Burgundy, France. And you'll notice that it's, again, it's unlike the Pantheon, it's focused on worship of God. It's got some characteristics of classical architecture in it, right? I mean, you've got doorways and you've got some arches up here, but the walls have to be thick in order to handle the barrel vault. It's really dark inside. It's really cold. It's simple. It's smaller, right? You can't get these buildings very big. A lot of architectural techniques have been forgotten already in the 5th century. But Europe's covered with these Romanesque churches. And this is the one where, if you're in Burgundy, this is where the Santiago de Compostela pilgrimage begins. So when I was there a couple of years ago, in the morning at the church service, the pèlerins, the pilgrims that were going to walk all the way to Santiago, gathered for a blessing, and they got their little passports stamped. And then they went out into the cold weather with their backpacks, and I have no idea what happened to them. You know, I can't imagine they could do more than 5 or 10 miles a day. It's going to take a long time to get to Compostela, right? But this is where the Church of Mary Magdalene, this is where the Burgundy route begins. There are other routes across Europe as well. And these Romanesque churches then knitted this network of pilgrimage sites and relics. Each of these churches have relics in them, right? In this case, the Mary Magdalene Church, I believe it has a lock of her hair, right? She was known to have long hair that she used to wash the feet of Jesus. And I think their relic is some long hair. Then in Neo-Romanesque, which is much later movement, kind of think neoclassicism, but neo on Romanesque, the best examples that I've seen, frankly, are all in Chico and Marysville. We've got some great examples here. Certainly across the way here, Trinity Hall, which went up in the 1930s with its bell tower, mimics the neo-Romanesque bell towers of San Gimignano in Tuscany, right? And then you've got Kendall Hall right out the door here, which is a neo-Romanesque building. And you can see easily, if you compare the facades of these buildings, you can easily see where the vocabulary of the buildings in the central campus came from, right? Romanesque. This is the backside with the rose garden. And then this is the school district office in Marysville, which has a whole compound of neo-Romanesque buildings. Every time you head down 70 under that little rail bridge, you'll pass by it on your left. It's fabulous, right? So you do see this architectural language develop in California, which isn't surprising since we were, we kind of belonged to Spain for a couple hundred years, and we belonged to Mexico for 25 or 30 years, and half the people speak Spanish, and this architecture has great consistency with some Spanish architecture. So it doesn't surprise that we are into this. Another form of well before Neo-Romanesque, but after the Romanesque period, what happens in the 12th century is Europe moves away from the Neo-Romanesque into the medieval or Gothic style, right? And this originates in Paris under Bishop Suger. And the whole idea here is to see if you can figure out ways to increase the volume of the cathedrals, to open up the windows, to get light in, right? So that the experience of walking through a cathedral becomes an experience both of the grandeur of the divine, right? And notice a focus on the divine and your position vis-a-vis the divine, and an experience of light coming in. So there's much more attention in a Gothic cathedral to what is experienced inside the cathedral than there is outside the cathedral. But there's still a lot of artwork on the outside. But the focus is the windows, the stained glass windows, and these large rose windows, 53 feet across in some cases or larger, that illuminate the interior, right, and give you a sense of the divine. But notice this system only works if you've got people who can build these buildings, and you got a lot of money with the Catholic Church that can construct them, and you've got a certain view of human beings as sinful and fallen creatures who are in need of salvation, and that God is the only one who can give you that salvation, right? So the architecture and the theology go together, right? The philosophy of the Catholic Church, the theology of the Catholic Church is what animates the structure, right? So the one on the left is my actual favorite Gothic cathedral, and that is the Cathedral of Chartres, which is about an hour and a half southwest of Paris. Beautiful. It was built over about 80 or 90 years, and it has two different bell towers. You can always tell Chartres from all the other cathedrals because the bell towers are different designs, both medieval. Inside it's an absolute marvel of sculpture and glass, and well preserved, right? The other one on the right is the one that most Americans, I think, and Europeans or French are familiar with, and that is the Notre Dame de Paris. Notre Dame in Paris. It sits on the Ile de la Cité in the middle of the Seine. It was built between 1163 and 1345. Again, not a massively huge cathedral, a lot of bigger cathedrals, but a jewel of construction. And this is the one that 6 years ago burned. And people were, when I was teaching this course 6 years ago, we came to class in the morning, and we went live to Paris, and you could see the roof burning on the cathedral. It's all been reconstructed now and cleaned up, and it opened up about a month ago. And I'm hoping to make a visit there this fall if I have a chance. So they've reconstructed it. The whole roof was wood and collapsed, and the relic that is at the center of this cathedral is the crown of thorns that was placed on the head of Jesus on Good Friday, right? Or, I mean, this is what they claim is the crown of thorns, and I think maybe the robe that was put around him. Those tend to be the relics. I've never seen them, though, because they've never been on display when I've been there. Okay, although they do occasionally go. And then, of course, the next stage after Gothic is Renaissance art, but which is largely neo-Romanesque, and then the Baroque art. And the classic example of Baroque art, well, some people think it's the greatest in the Western Hemisphere. I tend to think that it comes close to being the greatest anywhere on the planet, and that is the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, which was built over a 200-year period, but borrows heavily from the colonial Gothic style, right? And you'll notice that there's not much left of classicism and neo-Romanesque. There's a lot of decoration, a lot of frills and work that attempt to give the cathedral a somewhat naturalistic look rather than a totally austere reconstructed look. Fabulous cathedral, by the way, beautifully, and not well kept up, but it's getting there. They're putting more money into it. And then a little movement after Baroque that had a very short half-life was the Rococo, which took Baroque themes to the extreme and turned everything into this frilly kind of operation. The most outrageous example in architecture is a tiny chapel about twice the size of this room in Bavaria, in Germany, Wieskirche, up here in the top left corner. Domenico Zimmermann was the architect, and you can see it's all white with gold frills and everything. But again, very over the top. You know, I don't know about you, but when I walk into people's homes, right, I have a very austere home. I'm not quite that Japanese aesthetic, right, with nothing but a tatami mat, but my house is pretty bare bones. When I walk into the homes of people who buy into this Baroque and Rococo or into Victorian art, I can't stay in the room very long, right? It kind of makes me anxious, right? Because there's too much stuff going on. That's how I feel when I look at Baroque art. It's got a certain attraction to it, but it's over the top. Neoclassicism is going to fight against all of the trends that we've looked at. It's going to try to carve out a return to the first two that we were looking at, Roman and Greek. Right? And to try to get back to simplicity, balance, right? Austerity, harmony, clarity, right? All those words are used, I think, to talk about it. Now, why go back? I mean, in one sense, the reason you go back to the earlier stuff is because all the other stuff doesn't work for you. But another reason to go back is that things started to be discovered that made people aware of what these ancients really had. For a long time, Western culture had lost knowledge of these ancient Greco-Roman cultures, right? Up until 1213, 1400, we didn't have Western access to the Iliad and the Odyssey, two of the greatest writings in the Greek world, right? We didn't really know much about the culture. We surmised what it was like, but we didn't know. But in the 1700s, early 1700s, and then into the late 1700s, Pompeii was discovered outside of Naples, which had been covered thousands of years ago by a volcano, right? And they discovered Pompeii, and suddenly a whole world, the whole ancient world was opened up to them in ways that they had never seen before, right? So you have, beginning in the 1760s into the 1830s, you have this general movement back to the origins. Wow, sick and tired of this Baroque and Rococo stuff, but man, look what we could be if we took the lead and the guidance from the ancients. And so Pompeii becomes a focus, and of course, the British and the Germans and all these countries are doing these excavations, right? They're turning up incredible frescoes and architecture and home design, right? All of this stuff that is so different from everything that had gone through Europe. So it's pretty interesting. And then as you move into the 1760s to 1790s, right? Those 30 years, those are the years that both France and the United States are starting to move towards independence, right? Not only political independence, in the US's case from Britain, but in the case of the French, independence of the people from the monarchy. And the rallying cry tends to be the Declaration of Independence, the rights of man and citizen, right? The Constitution of the United States, we the people, right? You notice there's no divine language there. There's a real movement towards kind of individual liberty, freedom, autonomy, self-determination. Kant is writing at this time. Mill is about to write, right? And at that point, classical architecture becomes something that these people who want rights and liberties and democracy start to be attracted to. Because the only previous democracies that had existed in the world up until that time were in Greece. The Greek city-states were what we might call nominal democracies. Not everybody had a vote, right? Women did not have votes, slaves did not have votes. But the point is that it wasn't run as a monarchy. There were people in the culture who held different positions who had a say in how the government was done. And they got a vote on who would lead. That counts, in my book at least, as a nominal democracy, certainly an incomplete democracy, right? Not a populist democracy. You had to own land, right? You had to be the head of a household. There were all kinds of restrictions, but it still meant that people had a voice. These people who were fighting in France and the United States for liberty, independence, and stuff saw in these cultures and in their architecture an affinity for what they were up to. Okay, let's see if we got any questions or observations before we go on here. Yes.
The Baroque example that you had, was that here in the US, Mexico City?
Yeah, that is Mexico City.
I didn't know we had something like that. Yeah.
I know, it is absolutely, well, I know people like Vatican City.
Right.
I mean, they like St. Peter's, right? And they like Bernini's colonnades out in the front, right? But like this thing was built with local architects, local builders, native populations slaving away at these, all the stone was cut locally. The whole thing was constructed, and it's like 300 years in an earthquake zone, and it's still standing.
Very impressive.
It's pretty damn impressive, let me tell you. Well worth a pilgrimage, by the way, let me say. Well worth a pilgrimage. You can get a flight from Sacramento through Guadalajara to Mexico City and be there at 5 in the morning in time to catch a taxi down to the cathedral when the first bells ring at 6 a.m. and you can go in for your first mass. Even if you're not Catholic, right? You might just be converted by that moment. Who knows? It's really impressive. But you know, think about what was going on. We had in the 1400s, 1500s mostly, European colonial settlement. The Catholics had come in behind Cortez and established a network through there, right? It was conversion time, right? And the crown in Spain had lots of money, right? And so this money's flowing and everybody is into building to advance their colonial intentions, right? Later on in California, it will be Junipero Serra building the missions from Baja California all the way up into Marin County. But this is early. This stuff's starting earlier. Junipero Serra is not doing his work until the beginning of the neoclassical period. But his style he's using is all neo-Romanesque and mission style, right? But this is the one, this predates all that, right? All right, so let's take a look at again, just to remind you, here are the norms that we're using to kind of get us to first base, the Acropolis. And let me also say, this is another important thing. So this is going on in the mid-1700s. I mean, yeah, the mid-1700s, mid-18th century, we've discovered Pompeii. Then the British start their wars on the European continent, right? And they end up in battles in Greece. And Lord Elgin, or Elgin, an upper class guy in the British Empire, and he's already been smitten by neoclassicism, right? One of his reasons for getting posted to Greece was because this was where classical architecture began. So what does he do when he finally gets into Athens and access to the Parthenon? Well, like any good colonial at the time, he strips the building of all of its art, right? So the classical structure of the Parthenon was Doric columns here, the pediment at the top with statues, and then these little carvings underneath called metopes, right? Each telling an important story. So what Elgin does is he gets his crew, his engineers, the British engineers, instead of building bridges, they go to work on the Parthenon and they strip it of all of its metopes, which are here, and they strip it of all of the pediment or sculpture, which is this section here is from here, right? And they take everything else out. This is a close-up, and they haul it all off to England. And to this day, it's the central feature of the entrance to the British Museum in London, right? The Greeks, of course, want it back. The British have been saying for years, we're not giving it back to you, partly because they didn't need to get into that fight, but also because they said, you guys just don't have a good enough museum to show this stuff off. But now the Greeks have a good museum. They've just built a new museum near the Parthenon, and there'll be increasing pressure for pieces of this to begin to go back to Greece, I think, right? Deaccession is a huge issue. We fought this battle at Chico State 40 years ago when I first came with Native American remains. It'll be fought in museums like this as well. But what my point in bringing this up is not to kind of dump trash on Elgin, right? By the way, I have to say, when you go into that room, it's like going into a cathedral. It's pretty damn impressive. But you see, what happens is when he carves this stuff up and brings it back to England, and then it goes on display, Britain goes crazy. They go nuts over this stuff. And what all this does is reinforces what had happened when they were digging at Pompeii and Herculaneum in Italy, right? It just fed the neoclassical machine, right? Now you got to see things up close that no human being had ever seen before because they'd been on top of this building. Now you could actually go up to them. And when I was there, but don't tell anybody, there was no guardrail around it. I actually had to touch the foot. Right. You can't do that now. You'd be deported to El Salvador if you did that. But the point is that you get the picture of what's going on here, right? It was very electrifying for the British to be able to say that pieces of the classical world were now in their possession and on their own turf. And it really generated a lot of interest. And so we begin to see in the 60s, this neoclassical architecture starts taking over first Britain, a little bit into Germany and France, right? The French have got their hands full. They haven't, in 1760, the monarchy has not yet fallen in France. And they're not going to give up Versailles and other Baroque buildings and their own construction to this movement because it's going to show that they had capitulated. So neoclassicism is going to come into France a bit later than it does into England. The English are motivated on it very early. The US will follow quickly because, frankly, in the 1860s, we are British. That's what we are, right? We're not Americans. That doesn't exist, right? We're just colonials. So the examples are interesting. Usually it's public buildings that exhibit neoclassicism, right? But here we have an example of a wealthy landowner, a landed gentry, who's got an awful lot of money and wants to, in a sense, construct his own home along neoclassical lines. Up until this time, the classical manners throughout England tended to be medieval, Romanesque, castle-like places. You know, think Shakespeare, think Blenheim House, where Winston Churchill was born, right? Old style. But starting in the 18th century, mid-18th century, architects start designing things around this classical look. And it's pretty formulaic, right? So it includes columns, balanced columns. These could be Doric columns with the flat top. They could be Ionian columns like we see here, right? They could be Corinthian columns that are more Roman, right? A little bit later style, but they're all going to have a kind of a balance. And then they're going to have your standard windows. Some will have pediments over the windows, but that's a little too Baroque sometimes for neoclassicism. Certainly a central pediment. This one's fairly austere and plain. I would guess, you know, conventions hadn't really developed yet. There's not a lot of carving there. Maybe he didn't have the money, who knows, right? But then a balance of wings on it. And again, the theme of classicism is picked up in these windows, the balance of the windows and the pillars here, the entrance with a simple step up. Quite modest, but the whole theme, the whole vernacular of neoclassicism is carried into the interior in the library, right? The colors are a little more gaudy than you would think was appropriate for neoclassicism. Both the Americans and the French are not going to get into this kind of color, but you know, who knows what's going on. But he's got a slight dome over it that captures the style of the Pantheon in Rome. Right? And then he's got now, instead of Ionian columns, if you look at the top here, instead of Ionian, he's got Corinthian columns. So this interior is more informed by Roman classicism than it would be by Greek. The exterior is more Greek, the interior is more Roman. And then notice also the statues capture that these busts of important people capture that classic Greek and Roman style of sculpture, right? So it's a kind of room that makes me a little jittery when I go in, but it's okay. Beautiful. These are all open, by the way, as museums now because the people that owned them can't afford to keep them up, right? Yeah.
Was the house made for like royals or?
No. What you've got occurring in the mid 18th century in England is we're at the very early stages of the Industrial Revolution, right? And so what you've got emerging in the countryside as well as in the cities is a new class of people. The traditional term would be bourgeois. It's a little simplistic. What it means is middle class. And I don't want you to think about those middle class people the way we would think about middle class in US culture, right? These tend to be people who own land or own businesses, right? They tend to be wealthy merchants, you know, bordering on what we would think of as big manufacturing folks or people in tech, right, that are beginning to emerge as owners of businesses, as amassers of wealth, right, as people who are entering into trade, right? They're not part of the royal families. They're not part of the monarchy. They're not part of the church, right? They're another estate, which is the term that would be used. And so they tend to be, I mean, they might be, some of them might be lords, right? Some of them would occasionally be ministers of parliament, but for the most part, these are just independent people who own property, right? And maybe land, but you know, he may be actually, Kenwood House, I'd have to do a little more research. It may be on some land that was farmed, but farming is dropping off, right? Farming is being done in the colonies. Farming is getting a lot more efficient. You know, not every people are starting to move to the city. That's what happens during industrialization, right? Another great one. This one is an early example of neoclassicism, and this predates the fall of the monarchy in France. This is on the left bank, right? The Sorbonne in the 6th arrondissement in Paris. Sits about a 10-minute walk from Notre Dame down the hill. This is the Pantheon modeled on the Pantheon in Rome that we looked at earlier, right? But much bigger, much more impressive. I believe the last thing that goes on this building is that dome, because they were still struggling with dome architecture at this point. But notice again, you know, I gotta say, what really is attractive about this building is its proportions. It just has good proportions. You know, this is the classic thing that you've got going with neoclassicism, right? Is somehow the proportions seem to work, right? I mean, think about your TV screen. I mean, most of you didn't grow up with TV screens like I did, but my proportion on most of the TVs that I watched all my life were 4:3, right? But most people watching TV now are watching 9:16, right? 3 squared by 4 squared. It's a much more pleasing television to watch. And the reason is because some proportions just work better with human beings than others. That's just the way it is. And these proportions are attractive, right? Even if at the end of the day, you're not crazy about this architecture, these are attractive. And notice again, very Roman in terms of this stuff on the side, these decorations from Imperial Rome, right? You see this stuff picked up in the 1920s in Milan when Mussolini builds the main train station. He builds it like a Roman hall, right? With all these decorations. Then you've got a pediment with actual carvings in it. You've got the Corinthian columns. And again, it's an attempt to be a pantheon, is to show the liberality of the culture. We're going to build a temple to all gods, right? It's surprising that this was allowed to be built when it was, because certainly the Catholic monarchy, the monarchy is Catholic. But, you know, at some point you gotta figure out ways to keep the public from destroying you. So by building this, starting it in 1755, by the time it's finished, the king and Marie Antoinette had lost their heads, and we're in the middle of the terrors of the Robespierre period in the 1890s, and we're almost on the verge of Napoleon coming to power. Right, he'll be coming to power in just a few years. But so it begins in the days before, at the height of neoclassicism, before the fall of the monarchy, but it ends after the fall of the monarchy. Then let's shift over to a comparable period in the United States, and the best example of this is the 1785. Notice this is 9 years after the Declaration of Independence, and it's being completed. It's being started in 1785. It'll be done by the time the revolution has been fought and won by the Americans, right? Thomas Jefferson is the architect of the state capital of Virginia. So it's probably in many ways one of the most outstanding examples of neoclassical that we've got in the US for that time. I think it'll be superseded about 15 years later by the completion of Monticello and the completion of the University of Virginia and the Rotunda and the lawn. But for a single building, you don't get much better here in terms of neoclassicism. And then painting it white finishes the product, right? It's austere, it's clean, it's simple, it's bicameral, right? Which we'll see in the US Capitol. The state is a bicameral government. The central stairs are raised to give you that sense of climbing up into the idealized world, right? The pediment, again, if it's modeled on the Maison Carrée, which a lot of people, well, Jefferson would say it was as well. You got to remember, Jefferson was foreign minister to France, right? And so he didn't spend all his time in Paris. He spent a lot of time on the Canal du Midi and the Canal de la Garonne, going up and down when he had some leg problems. He spent a lot of time in the south of France doing architectural sketches. And he would have been at the Maison Carrée in Nantes, France, in the south, down in Provence, and sketched it. He also did the sketches along the canal Midi and the Canal de la Garonne for the locks that were set up on that canal, which dated back to the 1600s, and those served as the foundation for the construction of the Erie Canal, right, that he brought back. So it's a perfect example. I mean, you can easily pick out 5 to 10 characteristics of neoclassicism in this building we've been talking about. It's totally, you know, a good example. And then you can see that neo-Gothic church in the back, and state building with a bell tower. And then, of course, Jefferson's own home in Monticello, just about 4 miles outside of Charlottesville, Virginia. Very simple. He was always running out of money at this time, so it tends to be, you know, a work in progress. And he engaged in many characteristics that we would not consider normally neoclassical. Right, so he's got an octagonal dome over the top. He's got pillar. His pillars here are not really totally classical pillars. They're not Doric. They're not Ionian. They're not Corinthian. They're just a much simpler model, right? But a lot of trends inside, hidden walls, little beds that would fold down. He's got his library over on this corner here. And this was on his plantation. And then another building, I'm flipping back now to France, right? So now another building that's going up in 1806, right after Monticello. But now remember, in France, what's happened? The government has changed. The monarchy is out. Napoleon has grabbed power. He's fighting his wars across Europe, right? And what he wants to do is to build something that will be a memorial to his great power, right? Democracy is gone, but neoclassicism isn't. The French, if the Americans can use neoclassicism to buttress their democracy, under Napoleon, the French can use neoclassicism to buttress their empire, right? So that it starts getting used in a different way. But Napoleon, who has obviously been to Rome by that time, has visited the Forum in Rome, just up from the Colosseum, and has always admired the Arch of Titus. It's not very big. It's maybe 1.5 times as tall as this room, maybe not even that tall. 4 or 5 people can walk through it abreast. This Titus was the son of Vespasian and was responsible for winning the Jewish wars for the Roman Empire in Jerusalem, and was present. I think he was the mastermind of the 72 siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the city. And if you go to the Arch of Titus, and you can't walk through it anymore, again, you know, things were different when I was a kid and could do this. If you look on the wall right in here, you have a sculpture relief similar to this. You have a sculpture relief of the Roman soldiers taking the tabernacle out of the temple in Jerusalem and carrying it back to Rome, right? So destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans as a great upset of that part of the world. Napoleon wants to try to build on that. And so what he does is he designs a massive 150-foot high arch, right, in Paris, which celebrates triumph, resistance, peace, and then La Marseillaise, which is the clarion call of the French Revolution against the monarchy, right? So Napoleon is trying to both claim to be the ultimate monarch, at the same time he's trying to distance himself from the old regime, the ancien regime, right? And he does that by constructing this arc in the middle of Paris, right? And then redesigns the whole city around the Arc de Triomphe so that you have the Place de la the Champs-Élysées, right, which is the main road that runs through the middle of Paris. It means the Elysian Fields. It's the place in Roman theology where you kind of maybe, well, at least some people go when they die, the Champs-Élysées. And then the spokes spread out across Paris, with this being a focus. And it's an important, it was important to Napoleon, obviously, in this classical, we would call this neoclassical architecture. It's pretty, but I would call it's already morphing into something a little more weird, wouldn't you say? It doesn't at all look like what Jefferson would have produced. It's more what we would call now an empire style, right? And the piano in my living room looks like this, right? It's an old 1928 piano that my grandmother had, and it's done in empire style. And I think that piano in my living room weighs about as much as this arc, right? But it's important not just to Napoleon, but it becomes important in the same way that Notre Dame is important in the psyche of the French. It's important in the psyche of the French because it is the arc through which de Gaulle walked in 1945 when Paris was liberated, right? De Gaulle was, the Americans were going to liberate Paris. We were going to drive in Jeeps and everything that we've been doing through all kinds of places. But we allowed de Gaulle to come in and lead the Free French through, because they had fought with the Americans and they were in England, they came back over. And so here is General de Gaulle marching with his troops through the Arc de Triomphe. And then this becomes the focus of the tombs of the unknown soldiers from both World War I and World War II. And the eternal flames are present in the center of the arc, and they burn 24 hours a day. It's accessible at any time of day if you can get across the traffic. There is a tunnel you can go through as well. So it really does, it does hold important memories even in the 20th century for the French, not just the 19th for our hero Napoleon. And then a bit later after that, flipping back now over to the States again, we've got the University of Virginia. So Jefferson had been president and then lost and decided that what he wanted to do was to construct a university that would be modeled on classical standards, right? And so he didn't just want the architecture to be neoclassical, he wanted the curriculum to be neoclassical, right? Because now what you're doing is you're providing a university in a little town on the side of the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains, where you're going to want to educate the next elites of the Commonwealth of Virginia, right? And so he constructs this rotunda with, again, all of the elements of neoclassicism. The whole building is circular, right? It has 3 floors, first floor, second floor, and then at the top, you can see a shot inside the top of the dome. There's a seating area there. And then you can see the sketches that were put out where he used classical proportions to lay this out. And then down each side of the lawn, think of a tiered lawn coming off of here that runs 300 yards. There are steps down, and along each of them are 5 pavilions on each side. 4 pavilions on each side, and in between are little tiny rooms. And so what happened was faculty lived on the top floor of the pavilions. Students lived in the little rooms with bathrooms out in the back and stacks of wood to keep you warm. And then classes were held in the lower levels of the pavilion, right? So you had what Jefferson called an academical village, modeled on the academies of ancient Greece and Rome, right? It's a pretty impressive, place. And I say that in spite of, I say it because it is impressive, but it also is where I did my doctoral work, and I defended my dissertation in that room at the top there. So it still holds a certain, personally, I'm not a Jeffersonian, but I can certainly appreciate the neoclassicism of this place. Yes.
So the pavilions, were they on opposite sides, or did they just form one big
No,
line?
I wish I could get, I looked for a good aerial to show you. So imagine you've got the rotunda here. You've got colonnades that run here. Then you've got colonnades that run all the way down. These would be the colonnades. It's the walkway that goes right here. Then sitting off the colonnades are the pavilions on both sides, 8 of them, and then rooms in between, 4 rooms in between each one. Then out back, there are 2 sets of gardens with serpentine walls that he put in, right? And then the campus took off from that. This was the early days of the campus. Costs a lot of money to keep these buildings up, I'm telling you. All right, let's take a look at a couple of other examples, and we'll take a look at a couple pieces of art. So in the U.S., the biggest, you can get the rest of this online.
Thank
you. The biggest neoclassical productions are in Washington, D.C. during the early 19th century, and certainly the biggest one, and quite impressive, is the Capitol building. It begins during the period when we're at war with the British, the early 1800s, and it is finally completed in about 1865 to 1870 with the construction of the dome. So the earlier version is a small building with this kind of weird looking dome on the top. Just kind of a placeholder, you could think, right? And then by the time we get into the Lincoln presidency, the big dome will be going on. There'll be some expansion, but that building has been played with over and over the years, and some of the wings that have been expanded were expanded in the 20th century, right? But the footprint, the concept, the vocabulary of neoclassicism, which is what the building is really being returned to consistently in its modern updates, was constructed in the early 19th century. And when this whole place is still a kind of a swamp, it's a swamp. Nobody wants to be there during the summer, but you know, you gotta have a capital for a great country. So you start the construction with multiple, notice instead of 1 layer of steps, here you're going up 3. You've got windows with a little bit of a neo-Baroque look to them, but the center of the building is still really neoclassical. And then in 1861, this picture was taken in March of 1861, where Lincoln he's giving his first inaugural, right? And you can see, here he is, right here. You can see that they're already halfway through the construction of the dome, and this is going on when they're at war. You know, they don't know if they're going to win the Civil War or not. It just started, and they don't know it's going to go for 5 years and take a strip out of the country, right? But ultimately, of course, it's going to be one of the most outstanding domes and neoclassical buildings. But there's going to be periods later on where different states try to mimic this, right? For instance, the greatest city building in something like a neoclassical design is City Hall in San Francisco, built at the peak of its wealth, right? Tumwater, Washington, or Olympia, Washington, the capital of the state of Washington, is pretty impressive. And there are other examples of this, that the states began to take a great lead in building neoclassicals modeled on the Capitol building, right? Again, if you start doing a strict analysis of classical Greek and neoclassical stuff, you can lay out all kinds of characteristics that are similar, right? But you know, when you look at it with the new wings on the side of the bicameral government that we've got, the central stairway, you gotta say it's pretty darn impressive, and it's got a wonderful balance to it, right? It's almost too rational in the minds of some people, and we see that on the mall when you start going through the Air and Space Museum. the Native American Museum, the African American Museum, the Vietnam War Memorial, you go through, none of those are neoclassical, right? They've abandoned that. But this building, for many years, at least I would say, at least 70 years, maybe 80, set the tone for what was going on in Washington, D.C. And examples that came up later where neoclassical is used were, first of all, the Lincoln Memorial, which was built during World War I. And the years afterwards, the statues were put in. I think the statue was put in by French in 1920, I'm guessing, roughly. But the building had been constructed, totally neoclassical with Doric columns, just like the Parthenon. And then the U.S. Supreme Court building just behind the Capitol borrowed heavily from the Capitol's architecture to give the hill, Capitol Hill, a kind of a coherence, right? And then on the other side of the elliptic is the Jefferson Memorial, which again was built, started 2 years before we entered World War I, but it's a much smaller building. Modeled in part on both Monticello and the University of Virginia. So you can see characteristics there, but much more elaborate, I think. But also, 120 years later, or more than that, 150 years later. Here. This is from 2020. President Trump, a former builder, signed an executive order Monday intended to promote neoclassical architecture as the official style of federal buildings in Washington, D.C., and at new federal courthouses elsewhere, right? The order, this is how NPR interprets neoclassicism. The order defines classical as including neoclassical, Georgian, Greek Revival, Gothic, and other traditional styles. Gothic is not neoclassical, I'm sorry, but that figured into this first initial take. It also establishes a new President's Council on Improving Federal Civic Architecture, which is intended to ensure proposed federal buildings are beautiful and reflective of the dignity, enterprise, vigor, and stability of the American system of self-government. And then it talks about Greece and Rome and the city of Siena in Umbria as places where this is. Now, these two buildings, these three buildings are, the one at the top is the one you're in. You can see that we certainly abandoned neoclassical architecture on this campus, although it would have made sense to build this in a neo-Romanesque style, given what's on the lawn here. And there are echoes in this building of the neo-Romanesque architecture, and we could go through those and look at 3 or 4 characteristics. The bottom one, however, is the Butte County Courthouse, the Superior Courthouse in Chico that just went up over the last few years. And again, you can see that both of these buildings have abandoned the vocabulary of neoclassicism, right? I would also say that in spite of the fact that he's for neoclassicism, Trump Tower is not neoclassical. That's the building up in the corner. But here's the thing. But if you give, and Trump's position on this has gotten more, it's gotten stronger than this statement for 5 years ago. I mean, he's essentially putting people into the U.S. federal architecture field offices that are going to enforce something like a neoclassical movement. Presidents are always have the freedom to decide on what style of architecture is going to happen. That's just the way it is, right? But what's interesting is if you take the more sympathetic reading of what he's doing, in spite of the fact that Trump Tower isn't neoclassical, I think what he's saying is that we may have lost a sense of what it was culturally and philosophically that led to the founding of the country. And like the founders, but no different from them, really, what he wants to do is to tie an architectural style to a philosophy of political policy, right? And to say that if we do this, what we do is we hearken back culturally to a period where we had to think through in serious ways about what it was that we were going to become. And if you believe that architecture helps in the shaping of that, then that would be the moral argument from this position about why we ought to think about neoclassicism as being the approach. But the problem with neoclassicism, I would say, is the same problem you have with all the other architectural forms, which is, there's not just one architectural style. Cultures vary in different parts of the US, right? We do have a wonderful neoclassical building less than a quarter mile away from here, and it's across the street from Chico High. It's the old Veterans Building, built in 1919. It's a totally beautiful classical building. And I think, frankly, those buildings are wonderful, and I think interior-wise they're wonderful. But there are other styles of buildings that people would argue capture the complexity of the country. So if you want to emphasize the unity of America, maybe neoclassicism is a great example. If you want to emphasize the diversity of America, the melting pot concept, maybe neoclassicism isn't the best thing to be wedded to. But it's interesting to have these debates and to think about how those connections work. Now, let me just talk a bit about art, just a couple pieces of art and a couple pieces of sculpture to close out. Jacques-Louis David started out as a supporter of the French Revolution and very quickly began to realize where his fortune was going to be made when Napoleon took power. And so he became then a supporter of Napoleon. But through it all, whether it was before Napoleon or after Napoleon, he still tended to emphasize neoclassicism. And here we have one of his most important paintings, The Death of Socrates. Notice it is painted just 2 years before the Bastille, before the French Revolution really heats up. And it's that scene from the Phaedo, Plato's dialogue, where he is imprisoned for corrupting the youth of Athens and given an opportunity to kill himself by drinking a poison potion, right? And he doesn't refuse to do it. He does it. He does it and takes his own life, right? Because he believed in the authority and power of the political power. And so when David picks this, he's not only hearkening back to Greece, he's not only hearkening back to the values of Greek culture tied in individualism and integrity, he's also hearkening back to the authority of politics. The political authority has power. Socrates never said that he was being jailed unjustly. He accepted it. And this was his way of, in a sense, establishing himself as a person in the culture as well as an independent mind. And notice it looks like a sculpture. It's done very austerely, simple color palette, but quite an impressive painting that captures this neoclassicism. And then this one is in the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels. I just saw it 2 years ago for the first time in my life, even though I've been using it in classes for years. This is The Death of Marat. Before Napoleon, Jacques-Louis David is friends with a major renegade who's trying to overthrow the French monarchy named Marat, who's a writer. And Marat suffered from this horrible skin disease and needed to sit in the bathtub all the time. And so he's in the bathtub writing, and I think it's his maid who comes in and kills him, right? And so for David, it's there's an opportunity to recast the revolution a la Marat in what we would consider classic sculptural vision, as well as a kind of reflection back on the death of Christ, right? So oftentimes in the Catholic Church, you'll see Christ with nails in his hands and feet, and you'll see a scar where he's been speared on the side. And here we have Marat in the tub, still with his pen in his hand, and a stigmata over his right shoulder, right, to capture this. So David is working with a very limited palette here, but to great effect, right? The almost theatrical effect, right? Certainly borrowing from Caravaggio, who had been writing a century earlier. or painting a century. And then, of course, his classic homage to Napoleon is the painting of the coronation of Napoleon in Notre Dame Cathedral, where the Hunchback of Notre Dame is going to be based in the next generation with Victor Hugo, and where Napoleon essentially takes the crown, which was going to be placed on his head by the Archbishop, and grabs the crown out of his head and crowns himself the emperor, right? And I don't know if 2 years ago, Joaquin Phoenix starred in the, I think it's Apple TV movie of Napoleon, and he plays Napoleon, his rise to power and his overthrow of the government. But David is considered the artist of the Napoleonic era. Jean-Dominique Ingres is another guy who paints in this style, especially in his earlier days, captures this kind of neoclassical design. This guy looks like Julius Caesar, except he's all decked out in a lot more stuff. And then I won't talk much about this, but the move of neoclassicism into sculpture is also very popular at this period, and most American presidents, early presidents that were presidents during the neoclassical period, had sculptures done by them. The most impressive by Jean-Antoine Houdin, who was a French sculptor, did 4 of these of George Washington. And so they're located in different places. All right, so that's it. That's kind of neoclassicism. There's a whole slew of new art movements coming after this. And there's still going to be classical buildings going up. You can be sure of that. And we'll see what transpires over the next 20 years. I mean, we may see a lot. We may see some very interesting mixtures of architectural styles. So I hope y'all have a good day, and Kutsona will be back with you on Tuesday.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, take care. Have a good one.
You too.
Thank you.
Yep.
How's it going?